Good morning, I'm Pastor Tully here with my Wednesday morning message, and today's video is a follow-up from last week's video where Helen, the clerk at Smyrna Presbyterian, one of my 3 churches, she asked some really good questions. I'll put a link to that video in the description below, and if you haven't seen that video, you really need to go watch it first so you understand what we're talking about today. But in that video, Helen asked 4 really good questions. She asked, how do we worship? Why do we worship? How do you show your devotion to God? And why do you go to church? Now, those first 2 questions, they deal with this word worship. So before we can really get into answering those questions, we need to unpack what does that word mean. And of course, the first place to start is the Bible. So in the Bible, there are about 232 verses that use the word worship or some form of it, worshipers, worshiping. 156 in the Old Testament, 76 in the New Testament. I won't go into the Greek and the Hebrew here, but just know that these 2 words in Greek and Hebrew, in their original language, when you translate them into English, they get translated as the word worship, but that really isn't the best translation. A better translation would be the word prostrate. Now, I didn't say prostate and I didn't say prostitute. Those would be 2 very different, very different subjects, very different videos. But the word prostrate, it's got 2 R's in it. It means to bow down or to lay on the ground, showing your submission and your obedience to another person and to another thing or to God very often. And the meaning of that word is very different from the way in 2021 English speakers, particularly in the southern United States, the way we use the word worship. Of course, with worship, I'm talking about 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning when Christians gather together in a big room, all sitting, sometimes standing, you're all facing the same direction. You're listening to some guy, it can be women in the Presbyterian church, but other churches it's almost always men. You're listening to these leaders who do most of the talking. There'll be music, a choir or a band, there'll be prayers, a sermon. You know what I'm talking about. This is the worship service. And this is what we talk about when we talk about worship. Now, there's a lot of variation in worship. And this question, how do you worship? You could really go into a really good conversation around what does that mean? And how you worship versus how another church worships, the style of music, the liturgy, the order of worship, whether it's formal or informal. But I don't think that was really what Helen was getting at. And so I think we need to remember that when we talk about the worship service, which is really what this video series is going to mostly be about, we're not talking about the biblical word worship. Now, the Bible does talk about worship services. It just uses different language for that. It uses the word meetings or the word festivals. There's one scripture that uses the word solemn assemblies. There's another one, I think, that uses the word gatherings. Your translation of the Bible may be different from mine. The scripture that Helen read for us from 1 Corinthians, it used the word meetings. Now, for early Christians, that was getting up on the first day of the week. We call that Sunday, but it was a work day, and they'd get up, and before breakfast, they'd gather. Sometimes they'd gather for breakfast, but they'd gather together before work, and they would remember that Jesus Christ had risen. And it's that tradition carries forward today to what becomes the worship service as we know it. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this series. Now, I've kind of run out my time this day, and I don't actually have time to really get into the how and the why. We'll do that in the next couple weeks. But the last thing I want to say this morning is this is a conversation. And I want to know what you have to say. Why do you go to worship? Why do you think we have worship at all? And what is your mindset when you go to worship? So yeah, all right. Take care.